Knowledge Products presents The Giants of Philosophy, Immanuel Kant, narrated by Charlton Heston. Part 2.
Other leading thinkers, Hegel, Marx, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, would pay Kant the homage of disagreeing with him at great length. These thinkers realized that Kant's critical philosophy was a watershed in the history of thought. It's a body of ideas that no thinker who came after could ignore. Kant had the power to shape vitally even the work of his intellectual opponents. G.W.F. Hegel, one of the more important philosophers who followed Kant, said in his lectures on the history of philosophy that each great philosophy is its own age expressed in thought. There are probably cases where this is false, but Kant's philosophy does express his era. The great intellectual force of Kant's critical philosophy grew directly from its timeliness. Many believe it captured more deeply than any other philosophy of the later 18th century the meaning of modernity. Kant was not the first modern thinker, of course. His achievement was to deepen and extend the ideas others had first voiced or at least perceived. Kant gathered and wove together threads from many places. In France, the old order, called the Ancien Régime, had been under intellectual attack throughout the 18th century, especially by spokesmen for what was called the Enlightenment. Enlightened thinkers like Voltaire described the old order of society as both corrupt and irrational. Their criticisms attempted to strip away the justifications that had sustained ancient institutions. In this, they largely succeeded. On the eve of the Revolution, the more thoughtful members of French society generally believed that their institutions were completely arbitrary, hopelessly corrupt, and rationally indefensible. King Louis XV expressed the world weariness of the French ruling classes when he remarked late in his reign, "After me, the deluge." And so it was. King Louis's grandson and successor, Louis XVI, died by the guillotine. The most powerful philosophical voice of the Enlightenment belonged not to Voltaire, its leading propagandist, but to the moody and difficult Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau's work would deeply influence Kant. He had a knack for expressing new ideas as if they were the simplest axioms of reason. He began his famous political tract, The Social Contract, with these words:
"Man was born free, but everywhere he is in chains." How did this come about? I do not know. What can render it legitimate? I think I can resolve this question.
Here, in a simple form, is an idea of human freedom that Kant would seek to make his own. Kant believed the central ideas of the Enlightenment were beyond disputing. He also thought his task as a philosopher was to extend those central ideas and to provide them with a secure, unshakable, rational foundation. Thus, to understand Kant's purposes, it's worthwhile to examine briefly the ideas of enlightened thinkers like Rousseau, who was perhaps Kant's favorite author. Rousseau sought to show that the enslaving arrangements of social existence result from irrational and self-destructive urges. In a few terse paragraphs, he insisted that all existing forms of government were unreasonable. Because they were unreasonable, they were also tyrannical. Rousseau curtly dismissed the notion that strength or force holds society together.
Force is a physical power. I do not see what morality can result from its effects. To yield to force is an act of necessity, not of will. At most, it is an act of prudence. In what sense can it be a duty?
So much, then, for the supposed right of conquest, a right claimed by kings to justify their rule over conquered people. Rousseau similarly dismissed several other familiar justifications for political authority. All of them, he said, rest on the notion that social right derives from some power outside the will of individual men. Rousseau rejected any such notion.
To renounce one's freedom is to renounce what makes one a man, to renounce the rights of humanity as well as its duties. Such a renunciation is incompatible with the nature of man, and to remove all freedom from his will is to remove all morality from his actions.
Rousseau's principle is a formula for revolution. It says that no man is morally obliged to submit to tyranny, and the right to revolt against tyrants is absolute. It also says that all rulers who do not rule by the free consent of the people are tyrants, however benign or humane their rule may be. Rousseau and his sponsors, such as Voltaire, held that these political principles are the simple dictates of reason. For them, reason is the sovereign power in human nature, superior to every form of custom or tradition. The central idea at the heart of the Enlightenment was the notion that reason is a tool, an instrument of transformation. To achieve human betterment, one needs simply to remove the fetters that restrict reason. Reason's natural energy would do the rest. The Enlightenment's faith in the powers of reason was buttressed by the achievements of great scientists like Isaac Newton, by all sorts of technological marvels such as elaborate clockworks, and by new manufacturing techniques. The force of progress was irresistible. Progress was thought to be the work of reason, and reason was seen as the expression of nature itself. Reason accomplishes its work first by criticism, Kant writes.
Our age is, in a special degree, the age of criticism, and to criticism everything must submit. Religion, through its sanctity, and law-giving, through its majesty, may seek to exempt themselves from it, but they then awaken just suspicion, and cannot claim the sincere respect which reason accords only to that which has been able to sustain the test of free and open examination.
The Enlightenment thinkers elevated optimism from an attitude into a philosophy of life. In the process, they literally tossed aside as useless every principle of caution. They accused their opponents of being in the grip of superstition or even of being insane. Nothing, these thinkers said, should be allowed to interfere with the proper workings of sweet reason. We can see the outlines of nearly all modern culture in these principles of the Enlightenment. They both predict and promote the development of scientific knowledge, which can then be applied to the problems of human life. These principles also reject tradition, and this rejection has come to characterize modern art. They reveal a firm conviction that political and social existence can be revolutionized by conscious human effort. This belief, in turn, has spurred countless projects of social engineering, not to mention political and social revolutions. The cataclysmic changes of the modern world are all here in a nutshell. The Enlightenment thinkers were the prophets of what has since been called future shock. In a famous essay titled, "What is Enlightenment?" Kant offers his own diagnosis of this age of turmoil.
If it is asked whether we at present live in an enlightened age, the answer is no, but we do live in an age of enlightenment.
Kant means that his age is only becoming enlightened. It's not yet so. It's an age of transition marked by the advance of freedom. But what does freedom mean? Kant offers a very down-to-earth description of what it's like to live without freedom.
I hear on all sides the cry, "Don't argue." The officer says, "Don't argue, get in line." The tax official, "Don't argue, pay." The clergyman, "Don't argue, believe." All of this means restrictions on freedom everywhere. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and the courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore sapere aude, think for yourself, have courage to use your own understanding.
This spirit of freedom and independence was, in Kant's view, at the heart of the French Revolution. That's why he supported the principle of the revolution, even when he deplored its violence. For Kant, freedom is not so much a political or social concept as it is a moral concept. The underlying meaning of freedom concerns human character, whether or not one has the maturity and courage to think for oneself. Compared to this, political freedom, such as the right to say whatever you want to, is of secondary importance. Kant grasped better than other Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire that questions about reason and the struggle with unreason concern the very meaning of human existence. The struggle is not merely between the corrupt old order and the rising power of the people. It's not merely between decaying superstition and renewed reason. The real struggle concerns the emergence of a new kind of truly mature human being, a human being whose rational nature exists in fact, not merely in promise or hope. Above all, this new kind of human being is to be free, independent, and autonomous, with the courage and resourcefulness to be his own master. For all its rich philosophical complexity, Kant's critical philosophy is about this new kind of enlightened, free human being. Kant corrects and adjusts the misunderstandings about reason that had existed in the past. He traces the errors of past philosophers to their reliance on what he calls dogmatism.
Dogmatism is the presumption that it is possible to make progress with pure knowledge from concepts alone, as reason has long been in the habit of doing, and that it is possible to do this without having first investigated in what way and by what right reason has come into possession of these concepts.
In other words, many philosophers in the past have imagined that they can gain knowledge merely by manipulating concepts. They've overestimated the powers of reason. They've supposed it can achieve results without the benefit of experience or reference to facts. This flawed procedure leads to blind conviction, not understanding. Such convictions give no weight to experience. According to Kant, still other philosophers have made the opposite error. They have such a regard for the power of facts to shape our knowledge that they lose all sense for the power of reason to interpret them and organize them into a complete understanding. Kant calls these thinkers empiricists, since they believe that all knowledge comes from experience. Between them, dogmatists and empiricists have distorted the nature of reason, assigning it either too many or too few powers. Kant's first philosophical aim is to straighten out these errors, to assess accurately the powers of reason and its limitations. He also has a moral aim. Reason is not just a dry theoretical power. Instead, it's the wellspring of freedom. Not only must we study how to think clearly, but we also must learn how to act with clarity, with sound moral principles. To act morally, Kant believes, is the essential expression of freedom. Kant's final aim is to show how even our feelings and desires, our deepest hopes and fondest dreams should be expressions of the rational freedom that's our true human nature. Our sense for beauty, our regard for the awesome, our religious needs, all of these, once seen in the proper light, are expressions of reason. Someone who doesn't nurture these feelings is incomplete, even deformed. To think for oneself means not only to be a good philosopher, but to be a good man. The French Revolution may be seen as the confused outward expression of the Enlightenment, its imperfect political and social realization. But Kant's critical philosophy, his revolution in thought, can be seen as the true inner expression of the Enlightenment's impulse to freedom and rationality. In the early days of the French Revolution, Professor Kant was already an aging, much-respected philosopher, important only in his native city and a few universities across Germany. But history has rendered a different verdict. In philosophy, the modern era tries to explain how reason works. Political thinkers like Rousseau have explored what kind of political and social institutions are truly rational. Scientific philosophers like Descartes, Locke, and Leibniz have tried to discover the secrets of rational inquiry and to show that only scientific methods produce genuine knowledge. It's no wonder that the era of enlightenment is sometimes called the Age of Reason. For virtually all philosophers in this Age of Reason, the fundamental problem has been to separate knowledge, the result of rational investigation, from various non-rational kinds of belief and conviction. Inevitably, their philosophies have been centered around theories of knowledge, that is, elaborate, detailed accounts of how man's rational faculties produce knowledge. As a modern philosopher of the age of reason, Kant is the direct heir to this tradition. It's not surprising, then, that his greatest work bears the title, Critique of Pure Reason. Here, pure reason refers to the theoretical inquiries and speculations of philosophers and other abstract thinkers. In this work, Kant offers his own investigation into the subtle mechanisms of human understanding. But for Kant, pure reason is only one part of the story. The rest, and for Kant its most important part, concerns what he calls practical reason. Practical reason is that reason which is manifested in our actions. Kant describes this as the expression of freedom in both the theoretical and the practical parts of his philosophy. Kant's work differs from that of his modern predecessors. He examines reason not only as it's used in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding, but as a central element in every aspect of life. Critique of Pure Reason is a book of nearly 700 pages. It contains a wealth of material. It's also, for the most part, badly written, poorly organized, and confusing. Even the later German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who was no stylist himself, criticized Kant's writing.
Its study is made difficult by its diffuseness and prolixity, and by the peculiar terminology found in it. In the presentation, there is a lack of philosophical abstraction, and it is expressed in barbarous terminology.
Few modern readers would agree with Hegel that Kant's work lacks abstraction, but most would concede that the critique contains a luminous core that's well worth digging out. Some of the difficulties of this book are due to its hasty composition. Although he worked on it for more than 10 years, Kant's final composition seems to have taken a very short time. Scholars have argued persuasively that the published version combined material from several drafts, and these were not always consistent. In this regard, the distinguished English commentator on Kant, Norman Kemp Smith, writing in 1918, endorsed the work of his German colleague Hans Weihinger.
Weihinger's analysis is an excellent example of detective genius in the field of scholarship. He is able to prove that Kant's text is composed of manuscripts, externally pieced together, and representing no less than 4 distinct stages in the slow and gradual development of Kant's views. Like geological deposits, they remain to record the processes by which the final result came to be.
As Kemp Smith reports, the basis of Weihinger's interpretation is some loose papers Kant left behind at his death.
The fortunate accident of Kant's having jotted down upon the back of a dated paper the record of his passing thought is the culminating incident in this philosophical drama. It serves as a keystone in the body of evidence supported by general reasoning.
It's also worth noting that Kant wrote the critique in German, thereby breaking with the traditional practice of writing academic treatises in Latin. In fact, it was the first major philosophical work in the German language. Often, Kant had to invent a technical philosophical vocabulary as he went along. This adds to the difficulties of understanding him. On the other hand, writing in a popular language rather than in learned Latin was another visible sign of Kant's commitment to general enlightenment. As we'll see, the critique, imperfections and all, is one of the great philosophical landmarks.
This is the end of Part 2. Please download Part 3 to continue.